In 1909, the state of Indiana broke ground on a new mental asylum on a parcel of land outside a small town called Larner's Mill, in the flat farmland of the central part of the state. The land had been acquired through a state purchase 2 years earlier, at a price that surviving budget documents describe as considerably below market rate for comparable agricultural land in the county. The reason it was cheap was not a secret at the time. It appeared in the deed transfer, in the county land records, in the minutes of the state board meeting that approved the purchase. The land was cheap because roughly 4 acres of it, on its northern edge, were occupied by a functioning cemetery. A cemetery that had been in continuous use since 1847. A cemetery that, at the time of the state's purchase in 1907, contained somewhere between 300 and 400 individual graves. The state's plan, approved by the board and documented in the same meeting minutes that authorized the land purchase, was to relocate the cemetery before construction began. What actually happened is the reason we are here today. Before we go further, if you're the kind of person who believes that what gets built on top of something matters, stay with me, because Larner's Mill Asylum operated for 61 years on that land, and what happened inside it during those 61 years has never been fully separated, in the minds of the people who lived near it, or worked inside it, or had family committed to it, from what was underneath it. Drop a comment and tell me whether you think a place can carry the weight of what came before it. I genuinely want to know where people land on that question. Our story begins not in 1909, but in 1847, the year the cemetery was established. Because understanding what was under the ground before the asylum was built there is essential to understanding everything that came after. The cemetery, known locally as Founder's Rest, had been established by the original German immigrant community that had settled Larner's Mill in the 1840s. A tight-knit Lutheran congregation whose members had cleared the land, built the first church, planted the first crops, and buried their dead in a section of field on the north edge of the settlement that the community's founding pastor, a man named Reverend Johann Kessler, had consecrated in a formal ceremony in the spring of 1847. The cemetery had no stone walls or iron fence in its earliest years, just 4 corner posts and a common understanding among the community's families about where the boundary was and what the ground inside it meant. By 1907, 60 years later, Founder's Rest held the bodies of several generations of the original settler families, grandparents and great-grandparents of people who still lived in Larner's Mill, people whose descendants could walk through that cemetery and point to stones bearing their own family names. The congregation that had established it was still active, still using it, still burying its dead there. The community's relationship to Founder's Rest was not historical or sentimental in the abstract sense. It was immediate and personal, the kind of relationship a living community has with the ground that holds its people. When the state announced its intention to purchase the land and relocate the cemetery, the response from Larner's Mill's Lutheran community was immediate and sustained opposition. Surviving letters from the congregation's pastor at the time, a man named Reverend Otto Heiss, to the state board and to the governor's office, argue with considerable force and specificity against the relocation, not simply on sentimental grounds but on practical and theological ones, citing the documented impossibility of relocating graves from soil of this age and composition without losing the ability to match remains to markers, and the profound theological significance, within the Lutheran tradition, of the ground in which the dead are laid being permanently committed rather than administratively transferable. Heiss wrote 4 letters. He received 2 responses, both of which acknowledged his concerns and confirmed the state's intention to proceed with the relocation as planned. The relocation was contracted to a private firm in 1908, and the work was conducted over a period of approximately 6 weeks in the spring of that year, before construction on the asylum began. What the relocation actually accomplished, as opposed to what it was contracted to accomplish, is the central factual question at the heart of this entire story, and it is a question that the surviving documentation answers only partially and unsatisfyingly. The contractor's final report, filed with the State Board in June of 1908, states that the relocation had been completed and that all identified grave sites had been moved to a new section of a county cemetery approximately 2 miles from the original location. The report lists 267 individual relocations. This number matters enormously because every survey ever conducted of Founder's Rest before its relocation had estimated the cemetery's population at between 300 and 400 graves, meaning that the contractor's own completion report acknowledges, implicitly, a shortfall of somewhere between 33 and 133 graves that were either not relocated or not identified as needing relocation. The contractor's report does not address this discrepancy. The State Board, in the minutes of the meeting at which the report was received and approved, does not appear to have asked about it. Construction on Larner's Mill Asylum began in the fall of 1908, on land that the state had officially declared cleared and prepared, and on which, by the contractor's own arithmetic, somewhere between 30 and 130 graves had not been moved. Reverend Heiss knew. His 5th letter to the State Board, written after the contractor's report was made public, specifically notes the discrepancy between the contractor's 267 relocations and the community's own count of the cemetery's graves, and asks, in language that is by this point considerably less measured than his earlier correspondence, what the state intends to do about the graves that have demonstrably not been accounted for. The board's response, filed in the archive, consists of a single sentence thanking him for his correspondence and noting that the contractor had certified the work as complete. Larner's Mill Asylum opened in 1910, on schedule and within its revised budget. Reverend Heiss attended the opening ceremony by a note in the congregation's own records, and is described in that note as having said nothing publicly, but having stayed for the entire ceremony and then walked the northern edge of the property alone for approximately an hour afterward. He died in 1919. The congregation's records note his death in a single line. The asylum's first superintendent was a man named Dr. Arthur Pruitt, a physician who had previously run a smaller private sanatorium in Ohio, and who arrived at Larner's Mill with what his correspondence from this period suggests was a genuine enthusiasm for the institution he was being given the opportunity to build from the ground up. Pruitt's early annual reports are those of a man engaged with the genuine medical and institutional questions of his era, detailed, thoughtful, occasionally self-critical in ways unusual for the genre. He describes specific patients by their situations, not just their diagnoses. He advocates for staffing levels he considers necessary, rather than simply working within whatever the state allocates. One patient whose case Pruitt documented with particular care in his early years was a woman named Frida Bergman, admitted to Larner's Mill in 1911 at the age of 32, whose family name appears in Reverend Heiss's original opposition letters as one of the congregation families with relatives buried in Founder's Rest. Whether Pruitt knew this connection when he documented her case is not clear from the surviving record. What is clear is that Frida Bergman had grown up 2 miles from the asylum that now stood on her family's cemetery, that she had been a child when the state purchased the land, and that she had been, by her family's account, one of the most vocally distressed members of the congregation when the relocation was announced. Frida's commitment record, filed in 1911, describes a diagnosis of melancholia and religious obsession. Her case notes from Pruitt's early years describe a woman who was highly intelligent, articulate, and entirely capable of sustained rational conversation on most topics, but who returned repeatedly, in her sessions with Pruitt, to what she called "what's under us," the unexcavated graves she believed remained beneath the asylum's grounds. Pruitt's notes on these conversations characterize her focus on the cemetery as a manifestation of her diagnosis, a fixation that treatment is intended to address. But reading them now, knowing what the contractor's report actually said, it is impossible not to notice that the patient was correct. There were graves under the asylum. Frida Bergman knew it, and said so, repeatedly, and was treated for it as a symptom. Frida remained at Larner's Mill until 1929, 18 years, when she was discharged following the death of her husband and her adult children's petition for her return. She died in 1941. Her daughter's letter, written to Reverend Heiss's successor in 1942 and preserved in the Congregational Archive, describes visiting her mother in her final years and asking whether she had ever found peace with what had happened to Founder's Rest. Her mother had said only that some ground doesn't want to be paved over, and that she had spent 18 years being treated for knowing that, and that she had decided to stop talking about it, because talking about it had cost her 18 years, and silence had at least given her what was left. And in his 1912 annual report, Pruitt includes an observation that, given what was under the ground he was walking every day, is difficult to read without a particular kind of chill. Writing about the institution's grounds, which the patients helped to tend, Pruitt notes that the farm staff had, during the spring planting of 1912, encountered what he describes as anomalous subsurface material in the northeastern corner of the property, the corner closest to where Founder's Rest had stood. He notes that the material was determined to be likely attributable to the prior use of the land, a polite way of saying someone had found what appeared to be human remains. Pruitt's report notes that the matter was referred to the appropriate state authorities and does not appear again in any subsequent annual report. The state authorities' response to Pruitt's referral has not been located in any archive. What happened to the material found in 1912 is not documented in any surviving record. What happened to the northeastern corner in the years immediately following is documented, obliquely, in a facilities ledger from 1913 that records the installation of a concrete foundation for a new storage building in that section of the grounds. The storage building stood until 1947, when it was demolished to make room for a patient recreational facility. The recreational facility stood until the asylum closed in 1971. It was demolished in 1978. The northeastern corner of what had been the Founder's Rest Cemetery is now, as best as anyone has been able to determine, under a parking lot. Dr. Pruitt served as superintendent until 1931, 21 years, and his tenure at Larner's Mill has been described by every historian who has studied this institution as genuinely complicated. A man who, by the evidence of his own records, tried to run a decent institution in impossible circumstances, who advocated consistently for his patients and his staff, and who also oversaw an institution built on ground that he knew, from 1912 at the latest, contained the undisturbed remains of people who had been promised something different. His private correspondence from the years after 1912 does not, so far as researchers have found, return to the subject of the northeastern corner. Whether this represents deliberate avoidance or simply the normal way a busy administrator moves past an unresolvable problem is not answerable from what survives. A ward attendant named Mabel Kraus, who worked at Larner's Mill from 1915 to 1942, and who gave an oral history interview to a local historical project in 1968, described the institution's relationship to the cemetery question in terms that suggest the community's knowledge of the original controversy and its unresolved status persisted throughout the institution's operational life. "Everybody in town knew," she said in the interview. "I mean, everybody knew, going back to their grandparents. You'd hear it at church, you'd hear it at the grain elevator, you'd hear it anywhere people talked. The state moved some of them and built on the rest, and the families of the ones that were still there had never had any satisfaction about it." She said that several of the institution's staff, during her time there, had privately referred to the northeastern corner of the grounds by a name she said she had never heard used in any official context, but that had circulated informally among longtime staff for as long as anyone could remember. They called it the underlayer. She said she had walked past it every shift for 27 years and had never been entirely comfortable doing so, and that she didn't think she was alone in that. "There's a feeling a place has," she said, "when something isn't settled underneath it. I don't know how to say it better than that. Things that aren't settled have a way of not settling." The years between Pruitt's retirement in 1931 and the institution's eventual closure in 1971 were, in their broad outlines, similar to the history of dozens of comparable Indiana state institutions during the same period. Overcrowding through the 1930s and 1940s, inadequate staffing, a patient population that grew faster than resources could support, and a slow, gradual decline through the deinstitutionalization era of the 1950s and 1960s. What distinguished Larner's Mill from those comparable institutions throughout this period was the persistent, low-level presence of the cemetery question in the community's consciousness, not as an acute crisis that anyone was actively trying to resolve, but as a piece of unfinished business that the community had never entirely put down, even as the decades accumulated and the institutional life of the asylum moved on above it. A man named Werner Kessler, a great-great-grandson of Reverend Johann Kessler, who had consecrated Founder's Rest in 1847, was a patient at Larner's Mill from 1948 to 1953, committed following what his family has described, in the partial account they have shared with researchers, as a severe episode following combat service in the Second World War. Werner was discharged in 1953 and lived in Larner's Mill for the remainder of his life, dying in 1991. His daughter, a woman named Ruth Kessler who still lives in the county, described her father's relationship to his time at the asylum in a 2019 interview with a local journalist as something he never talked about directly, but that you could feel was always there, the way certain things are always in a room, even when nobody mentions them. What Ruth also described, and what the journalist found compelling enough to include in the eventual article, was something her father had told her once, late in his life, about a specific memory from his years at Larner's Mill. He had been assigned, as part of the institution's patient labor program, to groundskeeping work in various sections of the property, including, on at least one occasion, the northeastern corner. He told Ruth that working in that section of the grounds had felt different from the rest of the property in a way he said he couldn't fully articulate, and that when he had mentioned this to an older staff member, he didn't say who, the staff member had looked at him for a moment and then said, quietly, "You're not the first one to say that about this corner." Werner had asked what the staff member meant. The staff member had said only that some history stays in the ground, and had moved the conversation elsewhere. Werner had asked his family about the Founder's Rest history when he got home in 1953, and had, by Ruth's account, sat very quietly for a long time when his mother explained what had happened in 1908. He never went back past that property again, Ruth said. Not in the 40 years he lived here after he got out. He'd go the long way around. Every time. The asylum closed in 1971. The buildings came down through the late 1970s and early 1980s. The parking lot went in over the northeastern corner in 1979. And the thread that ran from Reverend Heiss's letters in 1907 through Frida Bergman's 18 years of being treated for knowing what was under the ground, through Mabel Krause's 27 years of walking past the underlayer, through Werner Kessler's decision to go the long way around for 40 years, continued, underground and unacknowledged, until Liesl Hartmann began pulling on it in the 1990s and found it still attached to everything it had ever been attached to. Larner's Mill Asylum closed in 1971 as part of the same statewide deinstitutionalization process that closed comparable institutions across Indiana during this decade. Its remaining patients were transferred to regional facilities, its staff dispersed, and its buildings left empty on the former founders' rest land for the better part of a decade before demolition began in the late 1970s and continued piecemeal through the early 1980s. The northeastern corner, the underlayer, as Mabel Krause had called it, was paved for a parking lot in 1979 as part of a county road improvement project that extended the existing road infrastructure to the now vacant institutional site. In 1994, a woman named Liesl Hartmann, whose family had been part of the original Lutheran congregation that established Founders Rest in 1847, filed a formal complaint with the Indiana State Historic Preservation Office requesting an investigation into what she described as the incomplete relocation of the original cemetery and the subsequent construction over unexcavated remains. Hartmann had spent several years researching her family's history and had found, in the congregation's own archives, documentation of the community's opposition to the relocation in 1908 and a handwritten list, maintained by Reverend Heiss and continued by his successors, of family names whose relatives had been buried in Founders Rest, but who had never been contacted by the state to confirm that their family members' graves had been among the 267 relocated. The list contained 41 family names. The State Historic Preservation Office's response to Hartmann's complaint, filed the following year, acknowledged that the circumstances she described were historically documented and noted that the relevant property was now under private ownership and that any investigation would require the cooperation of the current owner. The current owner, a real estate holding company, did not cooperate. The complaint was closed in 1996 without further action. Liesl Hartmann died in 2009. Her research is preserved in the same congregational archive that holds Reverend Heiss's original correspondence. Her daughter, who still lives in the county, told a journalist in 2018 that the family had stopped expecting any formal acknowledgement of what had happened under that parking lot. But she said her mother had always believed that the most important thing was not the official response, but the record itself, that what Heiss had written and what Hartmann had documented and what Mabel Krause had described in her 1968 interview were all part of the same thread, a community's attempt to say, across more than a century, that something had happened here that deserved to be named, even if the state had decided it was easier to pave it over than to reckon with it. I wanted to see what was left. We're standing now in what used to be the northeastern corner of the Larner's Mill Asylum grounds, and what's here today is exactly what you'd expect. A parking lot, flat, unremarkable, the kind of surface that exists in 1,000 similar spots across the country without anyone giving it a second thought. There's a gas station on one side and a farm supply store on the other, and cars pulling in and out, and nothing at all that marks this as different from any other patch of asphalt in this county. I talked to an older man who works at the farm supply store, who has lived in Larner's Mill his entire life, before coming out here. He knew the history immediately, said it was the kind of thing that people in town knew without necessarily talking about it much, a piece of the county's past that was part of the texture of the place without being something that came up in ordinary conversation. He said his grandfather had known families whose relatives were in Founder's Rest when the state bought the land, and that the feeling in the community at the time, as it had been passed down to him, was less anger than a kind of grim resignation. The state was going to do what the state was going to do, and the people of Larner's Mill were not going to stop it, and the best they could do was remember that something had been there and make sure the next generation knew it too. He pointed to the section of the parking lot closest to the old road line and said, "That's where they say it is, the underlayer." He used the word without any apparent awareness that I'd already found it in Mabel Krause's 1968 interview. It had simply survived, the way certain pieces of local knowledge survive, passed down not in any document, but in the particular way people point at a piece of ground when they want someone to understand that what looks like nothing is not nothing. I'll leave you with Liesl Hartmann and her 41 family names, because I think they represent, as precisely as anything else in this story, what a century of official indifference to an unofficial wrong actually costs. A congregation established a cemetery in 1847 because the dead deserved a permanent place. The state bought that land in 1907, promised to move the dead, moved some of them, and built on the rest. A contractor filed a report, saying the work was complete. A board accepted the report without asking about the arithmetic. A superintendent found something in 1912 and referred it to authorities, who left no record of responding. A recreational facility was built. A parking lot was paved. And one woman spent years of her life documenting all of it, not because she expected to change what had already been done, but because she believed, as Reverend Heiss had believed a century before her, that the people under that ground had names, and that names deserved to be spoken, and that the speaking of them was the minimum the living owed the dead. The underlayer is still there, under the asphalt, under the years, under a parking lot in central Indiana that most people drive across without giving it a second thought. And somewhere, in a congregational archive in Larner's Mill, Liesl Hartmann's list of 41 family names is still waiting for a state that has not yet decided to look. Thanks so much for watching. If this story moved you, stick around. There are more forgotten stories like this one waiting to be told, and I'd be glad to have you along for the next one.